Hello everyone, my name is Heather and this is Sian. We're really happy to be joining you from Western Australia. Before we start our talk on love and other terrors, we want to acknowledge that we both live and work on the unceded lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay our deepest respects and gratitude to elders past and present. This presentation is based on a chapter Sian and I have written for a forthcoming collection coming out with Bloomsbury. The book is called Epistemic Genres, New Formations in Digital Game Genres, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but it is publishing in July 2025. We actually wrote the first version of this back in 2022, so it's really exciting that it's like a real thing with a real cover. So today we're going to give an overview of what we talk about in the chapter and discuss some of the findings of the project. There are quite a lot of case studies in this work, so we won't go into depth with every one. However, hopefully they give a bit of an indication of some of the ideas we're exploring in this chapter.
So, to be brief, dating sims originate from Japan, but there's a growing collection of English language dating simulators. And for us, we define that as being games released first in English. As well as that, the presence of romance in major English language video game franchises really demonstrates to us that the romantic genre of play has quite a lot of influence on the works of English language developers. So, in this chapter, we focus on three primary effects that we notice emerge from intimacy in English language romantic games. Feelings of adoration, vulnerability, and uncanniness. And we explore how they're represented in a bunch of different games.
A really important researcher and scholar of this project is Shaka McLinton, and in this chapter we build from McLinton's definition of intimacy as an imminent experience that is a precondition to various forms of affect, has a relation to proximity and distance, and is composed largely of feeling more or less connected as if one belongs or if one doesn't. What we really like about McLinton's work is it acknowledges the relationship intimacy has with fantasy, longing, and aspiration, but it also encapsulates realized intimacy as well as the vital relationship intimacy has to failure and vulnerability.
So we go into depth on this in the actual chapter, but to be brief, a dating simulator is a story-based video game genre where the central goal is to develop, partake in, or sustain a romantic relationship with another character, or maybe even multiple characters. It has its history in 70s shoujo manga, Erdtree, Otome games, and of course visual novels. And in terms of the theme, they tend to be slice of life or Bildungsroman. In this sense, the protagonist tends to go on a journey of self-actualization and discovery.
Through kissing.
Through kissing. And in some games it's quite simple and there's not a lot of that. In other games it can be quite a lot. It really varies. And there can also be choices and multiple endings. So generally a good ending would be seen as ending up in a relationship with another character or like feeling happy in some capacity. A bad ending might be being rejected by a character, perhaps even death, or maybe the other character is actually not a very nice person, that sort of thing. And there's also some endings that are more ambivalent, and that could be a cause for like a bit of reflection or just be a little bit more complicated.
Queer narratives in English language dating sims are an important part of this chapter and also to us. So we talk about it throughout the case studies, but we acknowledge that designer-identified queer games are still a relatively small proportion of the video game market, and queerness in video games itself is complex and multifaceted. In this chapter, we view a queer game as one that represents queer intimacy or one that is designed, interpreted, or played queerly. In Bo Bruberg's words, a queer game is one that can imagine alternative ways of being and make space within structures of power for resistance through play.
So developers of English language dating sims have taken many cues from the character archetypes of Japanese dating sims, but also putting them in the intersection of different contexts and experiences. So using Beautiful Glitch's Monster Prom series as a key example, we propose that the inscription of intimacy and the relationship that it has to adoration seems to emerge at the intersection of three primary qualities. So first, the choices the player is given to express themselves in the game, that is the structure of temporary agency that they inhabit while they're playing the game. So this can include things like gender, sexuality, aesthetics, or whatever preferences and choices they develop during play. Second is the recognition of something desirably familiar in a romantic interest, or maybe even desirably unfamiliar, and in that sense they're playing the same archetypical logic as Japanese counterparts. And the third one, which we think is potentially the most important, is a disruption or a subversion of a character's archetype. So here there's the expression of a certain kind of vulnerability of the truth that tends to emerge from the player's continued efforts to be intimate with their in-game romantic interests.
Majority, if not all, dating simulators are structured around the establishment of a kind of intimacy between the player and game characters. However, intimacy as a thing can be filled with positive, negative, and sometimes more ambiguous emotional experiences. In this chapter, we observe an emerging trend in English language dating simulators that use the narrative and gameplay elements of the romance genre to challenge or question what it means to succeed in love. These games examine more challenging aspects of romantic entanglements, things like awkward communication, unwanted advances, breakups, lack of emotional availability, presenting remotely via Zoom, and use the player's intimacy with the game to explore different experiences of emotional vulnerability.
So, for example, in Boyfriend Dungeon by Kickfox Games and Florence by Mountains, both of those use the romantic game as a medium to explore the complex way that intimacy and agency operates between individuals, but also in society. So Florence, for instance, the gameplay there happens through really simple visual mini-games, and they tend to represent joyful and vulnerable emotional experiences, but also the changing flows of agency in a relationship.
When it was published, Boyfriend Dungeon received critical acclaim as well as quite a bit of resistance from critics and players for exploring alongside its story about love and understanding some darker, more insidious qualities of desire, particularly like obsession, entitlement, control, disrespect, and lacks of privacy. We think that these themes and this development in romance games is something striking about the genre and its capacity to explore and communicate complex personal emotions that perhaps has something to do with its popularity and adoption across other video game genres.
So while darker themes dating sims aren't really new, players of English language dating sims have really shown quite a clear interest in contrasting the dating sim experience with experiences of like the gothic, the uncanny, and the eerie. And we really feel like the popularity of the uncanny and the eerie emerges in part from the intimate and often intense contrast of adoration and vulnerability in the experience of play. So we feel like these interruptions stem from adoring and vulnerable effects. So that lets the games explore complex and subversive experiences of intimacy. We discussed this more in relation to Doki Doki Literature Club and Dream Daddy. In particular, Doki Doki is super interesting because it reveals itself to be a horror game in the guise of a dating sim.
Dream Daddy, which we all know and love, is set in a seemingly idyllic gay suburban utopia, but throughout the game it uses uncanny events and interruptions to destabilize but not destroy the fantasy of the dating sim. As a game with an explicitly gay narrative, these uncanny interruptions we read can also be interpreted as moments when the utopia of Maple Bay gives in to the weight of the real North American suburbia. These moments at times seem to allude to feelings of anxiety stemming from the historic oppression and violence towards queer individuals in suburban and urban spaces. As a bit of an aside, on a metatextual level as well, many earlier video games that included romance replicated this violence. One of our favourite, most horrific examples is the Leisure Suit Larry 6, which was published in 1983, and is on the LGBTQ game archive because it does include this stuff, where in that game, flirting with a male hotel attendant caused the game to end, like you died, and intimacy with a trans individual resulted in the protagonist retching in the bathroom. In Dream Daddy, we suggest the use of the uncanny in an otherwise joyful narrative about queer love can be observed as a means of acknowledging and making manifest the significance of the anxieties of suburbia in the context of an imagined world where such anxieties never existed.
So we think that dating sims are designed to encourage their players to make believe in intimacy that is not only virtual, but also at times a bit awkward, sweet, tacky, and at the mercy of various interpersonal mishaps and failures. The games that have received more serious study, like Doki Doki Literature Club, are interesting in that they tend to intercept the intimacy with terrifying experiences.
As well as being a genre that uses gameplay and narrative to articulate the heart-racing, joyful, clarifying experiences of intimacy, they also engage with more ambivalent ones. They explore what it feels like for the player's intimacy to be invaded, disrespected, controlled, or when environments and social systems threaten or actively interrupt our intimacies. We end this chapter on a bit of a provocation that romance games are a practice of intimacy, but they may also be an art form capable of inscribing what intimacy means to us in different contexts and moments of time.
So thank you so much for watching our presentation. As a reminder, the book on game genres comes out mid-year and has a collection of wonderful essays. And if you like, you can also check out our podcast, Meaningful Play. See ya.
See ya.
So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. For those of you who are listening on Zoom, you can read the slides afterwards for anything you've missed. So, what makes Otome games an interesting site for feminist research is how they allow other female players the chance to actively pursue their own romantic fantasies, including some fairly non-normative ones. For example, in Otome games, it's pretty common for your boyfriend to lock you up in a cage, and it's actually seen as pretty desirable. So Otome games do reverse the typically gendered role of the spectator and allow female players a lot more agency during play. On the other hand, though, Otome games have inherited a lot of the conservative ideological traditions of traditional romance media, which leads me to my question. Does this reversal of gender norms in Otome games truly constitute a pass key to empowerment for female players? My research will look into how Otome games oscillate between empowering and disempowering in their distinctly gendered romantic fantasies, as well as their patterns, practices, and play styles. So to understand the radical impacts of Otome games, I'd like to situate them against the hegemony of play. The hegemony of play refers to the gendered cultural, commercial, and technological structures that ensure that gaming remains a primarily masculine cultural pursuit. What this does is it neutralizes the gendered hierarchy in games, where we see that the interests of the typical straight white male gamer, as well as their associated hardcore playing styles, are prioritized to the exclusion of minority players and play styles. Otome games diverge very much from the hegemony of play in terms of narrative, audience, production, etc. The previous research has hence talked about them as being both empowering and disempowering for their audiences. But most of these studies have focused solely on their effects on audiences, leaving a big research gap because there's very little research into Otome games themselves as cultural objects and what they actually contain as texts. So this leads me to my research. So I conducted digital feminist textual analysis, and what I did was I performed a close reading of 4 personality-based male love interest archetypes. Why I chose to investigate archetypes over specific games is that each of these archetypes are linked to specific romantic fantasies, and they first reveal how male desirability is constructed for female audiences. So what I did was I open-coded dialogue, CGs, and player choices. My analysis was grounded in 2 theories of gendered gazing, the first being Laura Mulvey's iconic male gaze theory, as well as the game-specific feminine gaze theory by Stephanie C. Jennings, which responds to that. So what this allowed me to do was to explore the male activity subject, female object passivity binary within media, as well as looking into whether games, especially their unique features like inbuilt interactivity, alter this binary in any meaningful ways. So I'll now move on to a quick discussion of my findings. Keep in mind that it is shortened, and the journal article I'm working on will hopefully expand on these things. So the first trope I'd like to talk about is the playboy, and this refers to male characters who have very casual attitudes towards sex. The 2 major themes I saw popping up, the first was non-relational sexuality. So interestingly, male promiscuity was actually never physically performed. It remained purely verbal, but we still saw the reactivation of gender norms, especially those equating men with hypersexuality and women with purity, through how verbal flirtation was used as a narrative device. And in particular, verbal flirtation was significant because of the way that heroines were scripted to respond to it and the choices that players were rewarded for making, which is invariably to act in disgust. The second theme was sexual harassment and violence. So that the way it was framed depended on its level of perceived moral severity. So casual sexual harassment was often used as a comedic device to establish the sexual naivety of the heroine, but in cases of sexual assault, we saw that sexual violence was oftentimes romanticized, and this was because it was used as a narrative device so that female characters never had to act sexually forward, but could be still involved in a romantic scenario. The next trope I'd like to talk about is the queer. So these are male characters who are defined by their rationality and also their emotional indifference towards the heroine. The first major theme I saw pop up was patriarchal leadership. So we saw that in these games, we saw a lot of narrative arcs centered around social ascension in society for men, but this was curiously absent for the heroines, as their reason for being was presumed to center around romance, which is something we saw reflected in a happy ending. Emotional unavailability was also a very big theme, and is a very big theme in romance fiction as a whole. We see this very common fantasy of masculine hostility as being a front for hidden sentiment. But so heroines have to actually emotionally labor for their love to be realized, and that's something that this fantasy, to achieve this fantasy, essentially. We see that gender binaries are partially destabilized in the sense that the masculine, rational worldview always loses out to the feminine coded worldview of emotion and romance because of the happy ending. Yet we see that there's still a regressive view of gender, as women are presumed to have innate access to the realm of emotion and romance, which oftentimes naturalizes their emotional labor. The next trope I'd like to talk about is the tsundere, which are male characters defined by their hostile attitudes, and they often verbally abuse the heroine. So another major theme we saw was emotional unavailability. So we saw a very similar thing to the kutere archetype, where female emotional labor was very common in order to achieve that romantic fantasy. But we also saw some crucial deviations. So there was one character where intimacy was elicited through a mutual exchange instead of one-sided emotional labor. Gendered verbal abuse was also a very, very big thing. So we saw in these games, we saw a lot of misogynistic insults being used by male characters to denigrate the heroine for her imperfect femininity. So a lot of insults related to her appearance, her sexual behavior, her weight, things like that. However, gender norms were destabilized in the sense that it was always revealed to be an overcompensatory performance of masculinity. We saw these characters become vulnerable with the heroine later on, but hegemonic masculinity was always restored at the end through alternate displays of power. So at the end, we often saw emphasis on how the male character could overpower the heroine physically and things of the sort. The last trope I'd like to talk about, and the one I find to be most subversive, is the antagonist. So the antagonist refers to very immoral male characters who are defined by the extreme sexual, mental, and physical threat they pose to the heroine. One major theme we saw was violence. So sometimes violence was romanticized for the sake of advancing a love scenario, excusing some fairly questionable things. But we also saw that it was actually critiqued more in some instances. So there's actually more opportunities in the antagonist stories for players to choose options to resist male violence compared to the other tropes. We also saw that in these roots that taboo was a major theme. So a lot of these stories involve some fairly major taboos, including kidnapping and incest. But we also saw some other taboos like racial taboos. And that meant that this allowed for the presence of some fairly non-normative romantic fantasies with a very transgressive quality to them. And we saw that in these stories, heroines often underwent self-transformation as a result of interacting with the moral, social, and sexual other. So we actually saw the adoption of more fluid gender roles in these cases as heroines began to contemplate their own possibility for transgression. Because of the happy ending gameplay goal of Otome games, we often saw the restoration of normative sexuality by the end, which did put a limit to how transgressive these games could be. But importantly, they open up players to the role of possibility of transgression in their own lives. So Otome games are empowering in the sense that they truly do offer a diverse range of romantic fantasies due to the plethora of archetypes they contain. However, gender transgression is currently limited for an overall commitment to normative sexuality, and we see this most prominently in things like the happy ending gameplay goal, especially with its fantasy of monogamous togetherness, which is a very utopian vision that obscures the female emotional labor that it takes to get there. We see that gendered violence is very common and oftentimes romanticized, and there's also a lack of player options to intervene, but there's also crucial subversion at points. So to me, it seems that labeling Otome games as inherently feminist or anti-feminist risks being misguided. It oversimplifies it completely, as these games are capable of producing, reproducing, and challenging gender norms at the same time. Game-specific features importantly introduce new possibilities and limitations for the romantic fantasy, which are important to study because of the effects they have on female spectatorship, intimacy, and gender norms. My research is going to continue looking into this further by exploring transgression in dating simulations and where they can take us in the future. Thank you.
so much for that presentation. Really interesting to see that balance between empowerment and disempowerment play out in gender intimacy. Maybe not as simple as such a false dichotomy. So let's turn to our last presentation for today. And this is, I'll just pass to you because your title is on the screen. I'll put it here. All right. Fantasy and Finitude, yes. So I'm going to pass over to Max Coombes for the last presentation. You get to be lucky last, and don't think that you're the last one standing between everyone and dinner. Think that you're the exciting last presentation, and everyone here is passionate and excited to hear what you're talking about.
Kia ora everybody, my name is Max. I am an administrator at the University of Auckland. Today I'm talking about fantasy and finitude in the game Shadow of the Erdtree, which is the expansion for the very, very popular Elden Ring.
Something up with the thing.
So Erdtree looks large, but it feels very empty. And I argue this confronts us with the emptiness around which fantasy and desire play. So Elden Ring, for those who don't know, is a role-playing game set in a very, very big fantasy world. It's very big, but it's also dying, and it's in need of saving, and our ostensible role is to come into it and become the lords who can restore its balance. As we play through it, though, we become embroiled in the messy politicking of various factions and belief systems, leading us to believe that wherever we end up, it's all more complicated than that. And there's no way that we can confidently say that anything that happens in the end will make things better. So enter Shadow of the Erdtree, which is the DLC expansion. It was released 2 years later, and it gives us a whole new world landscape called the Land of Shadow to explore. To access the Land of Shadow, we must find the corpse of a demigod called McLinton, touch his hand, and that ports us to the new land beyond. In the Land of Shadow, McLinton is still alive, and he's completing a pilgrimage to become a god. And a few pilgrims have also passed with him into the Land of Shadow to follow him around, so we hang out with them. The Land of Shadow is huge, and it's gorgeous. A delicate stillness runs through the whole thing. And compared to the base game Elden Ring, the atmospheric effects become tangible. So they kind of abstract the landscape into a thing of pure mood. It's also profoundly empty, as I said. Where in Elden Ring, there's always aggressive, ugly life exploding into the picture. Shadow of the Erdtree is filled with vistas serving little or no ludic purpose. We enter its emotive landscapes, and on arrival, the game seems to point us to another, even more beautiful landscape just beyond the horizon. Before long, it becomes clear that we'll never actually meet this horizon, and that we're suspended in a kind of affective stupor, yearning for we know not what. So there's an ambivalence to it. The world is beautiful because it has us longing for beauty, and it has a sense of aching solitude owing to its emptiness and to the fact that it's effectively sealed off from the busy narrative work of the base game. We also know that nothing narratively significant can actually happen in here because McLinton in the base game is dead and McLinton on this side is alive. So while we can stay here for as long as we like, it can never actually meet the demands of the present world. So the two critical things I kind of noticed playing through it are that the DLC is on the other side of a portal or threshold. And the second is that when we arrive in it, it's eerily bereft of life. So both things, I believe, relate to the fantasy of a place beyond that can make this world mean something. By establishing itself as the beyond, Shadow of the Erdtree has us indulge and critically reflect on this desire, presenting us with a vast emptiness incapable of satisfying that very fantasy. To support this, I will first raise some common themes in literature on DLCs, and then connect them to the themes and concerns of fantasy literature. Second, I'll show how fantasy is predicated on a sense of lack and the desire for something beyond. Third, melancholic texts like this one confront us with the non-appearance of the beyond. So we end up consciously pursuing proof of what is otherwise an unconscious feeling that something is missing. Finally, I make the case that playing with melancholia has benefits, ambivalent as they may be. The purpose here is that in connecting the industrial concerns of the DLC to the generic expressions of text, Shadow of the Erdtree can be critiqued and analysed as a comprehensive artistic system. Analysing the game in turn allows us to make claims about the pleasures of DLCs as works that both meet and confront players' desires for the undying texts and the sense of a beyond. So here I'm talking about the common themes in discussions of DLC. Literature on it tends towards the utopian promises of transmedia, Henry Jenkins, and in the numb reality of corporate homogeneity and risk aversion in the production of text. I opt to take players' desires for DLCs seriously, though, as a way of understanding these texts and their pleasures. The themes that I note kind of emerge here are that they first extend the life of games, stopping them from ever ending. Second, they fragment existing narratives, proving their ends unstable. Next, they delay the gratification of play, or rather provide a new object of desire where the previous one was already met. And finally, world-expanding DLCs like this one cast narrative to the side and allow us to wander. In wandering, there's a renewed sense of discovery to the text. So this is a return of fantasy and the fantasy of discovery. And what we see here is that DLCs reveal lack in the original text. So in this DLC, the original text's pleasures are retroactively annulled. Really, they were only ever preparation for a new object of desire that now resides in this new text, the DLC. So the DLC then establishes itself as a portal to the beyond, whereby we can restore life to the original text and bring us back our sense of fantasy. These things are all consonant with the themes, drives, and world structure of fantasy literature. John Clute and Farah Mendelssohn write that fantasy worlds typically appear in a state of entropy. The people in them long for a greater reality that was lost somewhere. Portals and thresholds appear so frequently in fantasy literature because they present the hope of recovery and the discovery of that greater or more intense reality in the beyond. The sense of entropy in the frame world is actually exacerbated, though, by the revelation of the portal, because the fantasy beyond retroactively marks what's actually just before us as lacking. So Elden Ring is the entropied world. It is also the text whose sense of discovery and mystery has presumably been depleted by the player completing it once. So the introduction of Shadow of the Erdtree turns this into a problem to be solved and overcome through crossing the threshold by which we can, if not fix the world, then at least re-experience the sense of fantasy and discovery that we feel we've lost somewhere. The game revels in this because it feels like a dream space away from the pressures of the game proper. Its appeal in large part is its boundaries to the original text. So it's got a stillness, a frozen time, and a hollow beauty, and they all attest to an ontological fragility. So it's something that must be protected from the real and the demands of the real. Because it's smaller and still and fragile and resides within the game proper as well, it takes on the quality of a miniature. Yes. So in presenting beautiful stillness to contrast the activity of the real world, it encourages what Susan Stewart calls the infinite time of reverie. As our affective experience of this wandering beyond grows, so too does our estrangement from the frame world. And yet, as I've said, the arrival of the fantasy does not actually satisfy our longing. Instead, the time of reverie provides us the platform on which to long for more. We depart the lacking text only to arrive on unstable ground. The inability to meet what's on the horizon appears to be the driving force of much fantasy work. So Clute, Mendelssohn, Bill Gray all come back to the idea of Sehnsucht, which is the inconsolable longing for we know not what, as both the object of fantasy and the thing that propels its construction. Likewise, psychoanalysis holds that our entry into the social order cuts a lack in us as subjects and produces the sense that we've lost something that once made us whole. Julia Kristeva calls this unknowable thing the thing, confusingly. Viewed this way, like any good work of fantasy, Shadow of the Erdtree suspends us in longing for we know not what. It's a text that always points us to what is beyond reach, which is the thing that marks the desiring absence at the essence of our very being. In Benjamin Nichols' Enjoyment Without Exception, the author argues the revelation of powerlessness at the end of the game Limbo dramatizes our unconscious desire to fail when we play games. Our inability to fill the lack makes video games the ideal medium to repeatedly circle it, thus enabling us to enjoy it instead of holding out for the impossible exception. This is enlightening, as Shadow of the Erdtree wants us to hold out hope for the thing, but also to take a perverse pleasure in its non-arrival. Instead of waiting for the end, however, it does this moment by moment, removing almost all distraction from its somber emptiness. To play it is to play with our desire for the fantastical thing beyond and to witness its failure to satisfy this lack. There's something potentially dangerous about this because the game sets us up to be consciously aware of the failure of the thing to arrive. In fact, to get to the end of the DLC is to kill everything inside the miniature, making us responsible for delivering on this very absence. In this, we're given the melancholic insight that the fantasy mitigating the original text is predicated on its own internal lack. Kristeva argues that melancholic self-awareness has the potential to become pathological and masochistic when we pursue it too consciously. But she argues the melancholy text has us actively play with the pain of the thing's non-arrival instead. So rather than hoping for the thing that can cure us, we actively engage with the sensual expressions of the text that dramatize the struggle to produce the thing, the fantasy, and the beyond. So Shadow of the Erdtree is serious about the player's desire for text not to die, to be bigger, and to satisfy their fantasy for the thing. As a work of melancholia, it does this by confronting them with the paradoxes of this desire and asking them to become reflexively aware of it as they play. We play then within a container that does not offer the fantasy of escape, but instead reflexively calls on and has us meet again and again the painful ruptures that constitute our reality. In this, the thing never appears in its totality, but is given an affective and aesthetic shape that can be sensed, known, and spoken about. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It's quite telling here. We have a bit of a narrative going on through our three presentations, where we started with a sense of love and wonder, and we end with a sense of loss. Perhaps that was intentional, or perhaps that's how the narrative was meant to go from the very beginning. Let's open up to some questions. We do have about 18 minutes before we're scheduled to finish. We don't even have to prompt or pry.
Thanks. I have a question for Callie. Congratulations on the first presentation. It was fantastic. This question might be more a direction that you're planning on going for your PhD. But I'm wondering if you've thought about how players kind of navigate some of these like paradoxes of empowerment, disempowerment. And I'm wondering if you would describe Otome games as post-feminist in that sense. Like there's quite a few sort of feminist researchers working in like romance literature and other spring studies who are acknowledging that women are capable of watching and consuming maybe these regressive texts, but still finding pleasure in them, even though they're fully capable of being critical of them. And yeah, I'm just wondering if post-feminism as a concept is something that you've played with or intend to pursue or something to describe these games.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, so you're right that my future PhD is going to look more into this direction, looking into whether there are any empowering possibilities for female players engaging in these scenarios that might seem aggressive on the surface. I think post-feminism isn't really a term that I have brought up so far, but it's definitely something I'll look more into. My PhD project is going to use Stuart Hall and adapt, I think, Adrian Shaw's updated version for it, encoding and decoding, and look into how, specifically, I'm going to look into how female players contend with this through the lens of counter-hegemonic readings. So that's something I'm definitely going to look further into. Thank you.
Okay, wow, you didn't have to ask any other questions. I had a job.
Hi, this question is also for Kelly. I was just thinking about when I was looking at your presentation, stuff that I've seen online about certain, I guess like female consumers of romantic stuff, both Western, but also Otome and shoujo and stuff. talking about how they really crave like wholesome romance and like the idea of like green flags versus red flags. And like, I guess I was just wondering if that was something that you noticed at all in your readings of Otome text, if there were any sort of like, because I guess like there's that, and then there's also like people who really crave like the dark romance and like the antagonists and you did mention like yanderes, but I thought of that as well. And like if that was a tension that you kind of noted, if there were sort of, if you have any thoughts about, yeah, I guess like the people that do want that romance that is very simplistic and kind of like escapist versus the kind of heavier stuff.
Yeah, no, that's a really fascinating tension. I think romance as a genre tends to be sort of like denigrated and seen as something very simplistic, but it is very complex and people do want different things. And I think that's something that every scholarship should acknowledge, that they have different desires. I think my research was a bit limited in the sense that I was focusing on archetypes that had similar, that archetypes where I found sort of links to more patriarchal sort of traits. And there was subversions there. I think because there's actually a lot of archetypes. I think there's one paper where it discusses like 13 different archetypes in Otome. I think some of the other archetypes might be more relevant in the sense of like wholesome sort of green flag sort of games and male characters. So I think there's a lot more research to be done in that regard. And I will, because my research in the future is going to be looking more into the dark side of it. I don't know how much I'll be looking at, you know, green flag characters and things like that, because I think I'm very focused on the dark side. But no, that's really interesting, and I'll definitely look into that in the future.
There's one down the back. I'm going to come back just because this is a response.
It's David Harold, by the way, from QUT. I have a question for Max. So, and it's basically also a follow-up question of Malian to Ben. First of all, I'd like to say I admire continuity not only within the session, but also with Ben's stuff we had. But yeah, in Malian's terms, like why Lacan, why psychoanalysis? For me, this whole topic could also be explained as this socially cultivated desire to create the infinite game, right? The game that is complete, this the perfect commodity.
Yes.
So yeah, just another question, like how do you juxtapose like those two theories?
First question is why Lacan.
That was Malian's question. But I used to, that's to step up to mine.
No,
Can leave that an answer forever.
Second one, I really like that. I hadn't addressed when touching on the DLC thing, the consumer demands for undying texts, what you call the kind of infinite work of art. I thought, as I was playing the game, I thought it's actually really kind of, I don't know, revealing that as a strange and empty promise, right? Like that was my experience with the game ultimately, which is why I came to the idea of lack. So I had that sense of renewed wonder. I remember playing like World of Warcraft back in the day, and it set up portals, and I was like, oh wow, the fantasy keeps on going. This thing never dies. So to arrive in this undead thing, and it's like, we could make this bigger. We could keep making this bigger, but it's never going to solve that issue. So yeah, that's a really good point about how it's like a kind of, that's a socially constructed desire for that. And yeah, it might have been a bit blunt just chucking it in as like players' desires for undying texts. So thanks for that.
We do have more questions. I might just jump on that one with another brief question for Max. Do you think, or perhaps not to lead you in the question, could you comment on the way that people engage in games? If they engage at a superficial level, do they want as many DLCs like everyone who wants every sequel to every franchise, even though it opens up the old wounds of the previous content? Is there something there about how people engage with the game as well?
How do you mean how, sorry?
The level at which people might engage in the game. Perhaps someone who plays 200 hours in the original wants to play another 200 hours with a fresh look on that tape, as opposed to those that might jump around.
No, I hadn't thought about different gameplay types. I guess I was just thinking about like, yeah, linear narrative open world games and how they, yeah, big time investment, maybe less, I don't know, yeah.
There might be something there. It would be interesting
I
to
think
see
so,
the
yeah.
psychology of the player as well, and how that interacts with DLC.
Because it is part of the, as you said, like infinite remake logic. It's just bigger, more money thrown at them to make bigger. That's yeah.
Who are they capitalizing on?
Yeah, totally.
So other question, we had multiple hands up, so it's about triaging in the last 10 minutes.
Hello, so this is for all the people who are talking about the dating simulators and Otome games. So you're looking at some of these darker experiences that are shown in there with the archetypes as well as the submersive stuff. What is, have you noticed anything in the literature or through your own personal experience or talking with other people about what leads people to choose those types of archetypes, you know, to go towards those dark things as well as the things that they know maybe outside of the dating simulator they would never go for? Have you seen anything, come across anything that explains why people are going towards that?
I can answer, but does Heather want to answer? Or?
Perhaps if Heather and Sian are able to use audio, they are? Okay. Would you like to jump?
I'm happy for Kelly to answer first. I can go after her.
There's not much research being done on this, which is why my future research is going to concentrate on this. But there's one prominent article, I think it's called Sadistic, or not prominent, prominent article on this. There's probably the only one on this subject. I think it's called Sadistic Lovers, and it's more like a fan piece, an academic piece, and it's an academic anthology. And I think it opens up the discussion of why people might have these fantasies. I think a lot of romance fiction, a lot of people tend to assume that women are masochistic, which is why they might pursue these desires. And I think that's a very sort of like regressive way to think about it. I think fiction and fantasy has a lot of sort of complex elements, right? And a lot of people seek things in fiction that they wouldn't like to experience in real life. That's the appeal of, I think, horror fiction for a lot of people. I think when it comes to a lot of the more dark things, I think we do see, rather than like this fantasy of, you know, being sort of submissive as a woman, things like that, I think we can also see different fantasies, including, you know, the fantasy of engaging in sort of more non-normative things that you wouldn't contemplate in your own life. Also, a lot of these games, because they have taboos, there's this fantasy of love sort of beats all as well within them. And I think there's also a desire to experience relationships that are a bit more non-normative, going back to what I was saying earlier. And actually, I think a lot of the most popular characters in the Otome games community, so this isn't just a niche, are these like characters that seem very like violent on the surface. And I guess it also contains a fantasy of like, it does contain some fairly common fantasies of, you know, like fixing your man, but also some people complain about how these characters become fixed and they want them to be crazy. So I guess maybe there's a longing for sort of like more dark romances in general. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Did you want to answer that one as well, Heather?
Oh, yeah, I mean, Kelly's answer was beautiful. Something we talk about this a little bit in the book chapter as well. And similarly, we notice there's very little existing scholarship on these kinds of questions. Something that Sian and I both find really striking is that, at least slightly different, looking at maybe like Japanese games, but in games that are like English language ones, the ones that actually have like bodies of scholarship on them are the ones like Doki Doki, which are, as Sian might want to talk about, they're actually horror games. So it's kind of this like avoidance of talking about what this might actually mean. And we do, that's something that we kind of have, that's kind of the terrors section of our book chapter, that where we look at the sort of directions this genre is taking. But for me, like, I think I take dating sims very seriously as a form of art, and that's kind of how we approach them in the chapter. And the reality is that, you know, like, art explores human experience a lot of the time, and the sort of narrative or fantasy of dating does have this relationship to like proximity and distance. Yeah, so I think it's part of, most dating sims take quite seriously the complications of intimacy, and you can see it in the work themselves, but the ones that are taken more seriously in scholarship tend to be ones that are perhaps not actually dating sims in the traditional sense. Sian, I don't know if you wanted to add anything onto that.
Yeah, sure. I guess the main thing for me is like, I wasn't inherently interested in dating sims. I played Doki Doki and had a complete freak out at the twist and absolutely lost my mind over it, did research on the fourth wall and all that sort of stuff. So that's why the terror stuff is kind of like the stuff that got me into it. I guess what I've found so far is that there's an element of like, there's something, the enjoyment of that twist, like it's one genre, but actually it's something completely different that's kind of freaky and terrifying, especially breaking the fourth wall and all that is quite appealing to a lot of people. And also, I think just that idea that there's something kind of scary, something kind of happening that you can find out by playing more of the game, paying attention to what people are saying, that sort of thing. It just adds another bit of edge, I guess, to the curiosity and the kind of wondering and about the game. So that tends to be, I guess, in terms of the horror stuff, what I've found has been capturing people.
We have time for one last question. We've got about 2 minutes, 3 minutes left. Okay, one last question.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It was a really great panel. Question for Max. Max, I just wonder whether, at the end, when you're talking about the way Erdtree kind of corrals you into this confrontation with Black, are you talking about mourning rather than melancholia?
Very good question. So in mourning and melancholia, referring to the...
Yeah, I just like, are you almost talking about a conscious processing of...
Yeah.
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 I just wanted you to pick that apart, maybe.
Yeah, so for those, I won't go too much, I don't know a lot of this. So yeah, mourning's melancholia is directed towards an object that you don't quite know what it is. Mourning is when you have that object and you've lost it somehow, right? So it's like a real thing. And mourning you can get over, melancholia you never do. So you're saying that the mourning, the text provides us things to actively, consciously mourn rather than just be melancholy about.
Yeah, sure.
That's a good idea. I like that a lot. Yeah, I still like to think that even though we consciously partake in losing this thing, we become conscious of it. I don't know. I don't think the game wants us to get over it necessarily. I think, yeah, it might just be, I was reading Sanja Bahun. She wrote this book, Modernism and Melancholy, and she was just talking about how, like, basically the function of literature is to reveal things you can't get over. And I kind of thought, hey, this is kind of what that's doing. Like, especially in the game, like Kafka's The Castle, it's like quite a bit like the Windfish as well, the Zelda, right? You're in this thing, and it's like there's all these people trapped in here as well, and they're like, oh, you pass through the gate, but please don't. But also do. It's just we kind of lose everything we are if you do that. Yeah, she makes the case that's like an inherently kind of melancholy failure of passing through that gate, because the text ends once you do that. But yeah, I think it does play with the tension of like the object that you can get over versus just like the pain of living with it and witnessing its failure over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
That was an incredibly deep and existential note to end on. Hopefully no one's in crisis as we leave this session, but we're leaving on time, which is lovely. So it looks like we've covered a lot of really deep topics in this last session. Lots of interesting elements of dichotomies and false dichotomies and empowerment, disempowerment, and love and loss. So I think that perhaps Max mentioned it really well with that concept of Sehnsucht, where perhaps whether it's love, whether it's loss, whether it's terror, whether it's hope, We're all looking for something, but we're not quite sure what we want, even if it's in a dating simulator, not quite sure what we want. First of all, round of applause for the presenters. And a quick reminder that there are still games in the experimental track running upstairs. I've had the pleasure of trying 2 of them, and they are awesome. So please go and get on that. And then I believe we can now officially bring our day 1 to a close. So day 1 on Ghana land of our conference. It's been excellent. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.